Let's move on. Next, we have a panel discussion, ensuring sustainability. May I ask the 4 panelists to come up and please take your seats as I introduce the main focus of this panel. So institutions begin their journey into sustainable purchasing guided by definitions from organizations like AASHE or other, whoever is trying to measure you around sustainability. That drives typically the sustainable purchasing practices. At Michigan, there were some guidelines given many years ago to move the institution towards 20% of its food towards local/sustainable. This was set up as a goal for 2025. The latter, which is a sustainable piece of it, was primarily driven by counting spend under certain certifications. But if you think about expanding our definition of sustainability on food beyond procurement, clearly dining services, et cetera, have to holistically think about many other issues like wellness and nutrition. Alexa talked about that, waste and energy management, shifting diets to plant-based foods, carbon awareness, social justice, and student learning around these issues. How could sustainable procurement support an institution's broader aspiration for sustainability? The focus here is on procurement, so that's what we want to kind of think about, is there is a broader aspiration that institutions have around sustainable food. How could procurement support that? It's easy to collect data, or at least easier to collect data on procurement, right? Sustainable food procurement, et cetera. It's maybe much more difficult to measure other aspects of sustainable food on campus. So our procurement choices will need to support as much of the areas mentioned around sustainable food that a campus would like to aspire for. Now, food supply chains are not simple, they're very complex. Broad sustainability issues in these supply chains could include, as Alexa pointed out, environmental issues, human rights issues, animal rights issues. Certifications exist in some areas that apply to different parts of the supply chain. They may be an efficient tool to understand whether food is sourced sustainably. At the same time, there are limitations to purchasing only by certification, because maybe the certification has a narrow scope, do not cover the multitude of issues around sustainability. Institutions do not have the bandwidth to monitor our supply chains. It's a very complex task. So we have to rely on external organizations to help institutions along the way. The other question would be, do such organizations exist that could serve institutions broadly, not just on narrow spend on certain product commodities? Because it's very difficult for institutions to engage on a commodity by commodity basis. The other challenge for institutions would be, how does an institution report progress on sustainability or sustainable food procurement? That requires collection of data, as the last question was focusing on. What are the specific metrics that institutions need to use to measure sustainability progress that looks at the scale, diversity, and maturity of many of these institutions? Because if we talk about campuses, there are small campuses, large campuses, and very diverse student bodies, et cetera. What we want to discuss in this panel today is how various organizations like certification bodies or civil society organizations can support institutions like ours and yours in our quest for sustainable food procurement. So I'd like to welcome here on the panel, we have 4 panelists. You have the bios, I'm not going to repeat the bios. Philip Tocco from Michigan State University Extension, Good Agricultural Practices, Food Safety, and Food Animal Systems Educator. Next to Philip is Matthew Wooten from the Fair Foods Standards Council. He's a senior analyst at the Fair Food Standard Council. And next to Matthew is Michiko Shima. She is from the Fair Labor Association. She's a research and technical advisor. And they've been doing some pilots with Ohio State University. And finally, we have Julian Dautremont. He is from the organization called AASHE, which is Association for Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. He's the director of programs there and also a proud Michigan alum. Welcome, panelists. So the way we structured this is each panelist will briefly describe their background in about 5 or 6 minutes. and some opening comments. There'll be some structured question-answer session to each of the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So we'll start with Philip. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Phil Tocco. I'm with Michigan State University Extension. So Michigan State has offices in every county of the state that they use as sort of I don't think I need that one. That they use as sort of an outreach arm for the university. So I am a university employee, even though I work and live throughout the state. I work throughout the state, but live in are housed in Jackson, Michigan. So we all have expertises, and my expertise is in working with produce growers to meet certification body standards, specifically around food safety, but also some sustainability is sort of baked into the certification for food safety. As you look at the certifications, they are like Dr. Anapindi mentioned. They really do look at a very specific scope of behaviors. And it's important to remember that the practices outlined on a lot of these certifications are not the thing that they're actually, they're measuring specific things, but they don't really get at a culture of whatever they're measuring. For instance, with regards to food safety certifications, we're looking at specific criteria. They don't measure a culture of food safety. They measure those behaviors. And again, they're also only a snapshot in time. So we're only looking at one day out of multiple days or 365 days of production. So that's one of the things that I try and do is look at how do we develop a culture of food safety within the operations that we work with, and interpreting some of that through the specific behaviors in those criteria. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Matt Wooten. I'm a senior analyst with the Fair Food Standards Council, which is the independent enforcement and monitoring arm of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program. To get us started off, I want to I'm going to show a video so that our work can speak for itself a little bit, and then I'll just make a couple quick comments.
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her two small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey! Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food Program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food Program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
The
most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food Program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amra Walker, CNN.
I'm excited to speak with you all today about the work of the Fair Food Program. I've been with the Fair Food Standards Council since 2012 and have helped oversee around 200 financial and operations audits, the investigation of nearly 3,000 individual complaints about farm worker abuse, and have helped draft and oversee over 200 industry assessments into these types of issues. We're a detailed-oriented organization where we're concerned with making things work on the ground in a real and meaningful way. And thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Mitch Kashima from Fair Labor Association. I have a little clip on the slide. For those of you who don't know Fair Labor Association, we are the multi-stakeholder initiative between universities, civil society, and then companies. Companies can be suppliers, can be brands. This is how it started. When the apparel, clothing, and footwear, they are getting attention from using the workers in abroad, being called sweatshop. And many of the university has university logo T-shirt and sweatshirt. And that's where the universities came together with the civil society side, where NGO, where they have a voice in this, and then also the companies who actually producing the goods for you. So that's how they get together to create a code of conduct. That's how it started. And that's back in 1999. And since then, we have been growing the sector a little bit more. So we have a couple of agricultural companies right now. They are small group, and they have a very different approach from the apparel and footwear side. As you know, apparel and footwear side, they have a brand, and then there's factories. And then they go down to the cotton and all that down the supply chain. But we are working with the tier one suppliers primarily. But the agricultural side is different because there's a brand and then there's multiple layers, and then where you're concerned about is at the farm, which is tier 4, tier 5, depending on the supply chain. So, but that's where we are working on. And I'm going to talk about the project we do. This is the organization is, and then we do a side project for some of the member companies, and then as well as non-member companies. And Ohio State University is one of the members. So the project is for Ohio State University being the buyer of food product, it's far away from the farm. And what can they do is the question everybody would have. So to do that, we first trying to define the scope. I'm just going to talk about the framework of this. Define the scope, because you can't go after every product. You can't go after every supply chain. So you can just kind of pick and choose. And those are the typically three things that you mix and match and then decide on the priorities. But commodities or vendor or supply chain model, because some of the university has many different procurement style within the university, so you can't do one thing and then it applies to the rest of your organization. So you pick one of those, and we are developing a tool. I'm hoping we have this tool for apparel side, but it's a little more complicated because we don't really have a retail buyer. Many of the companies at brand level, they directly produce, work with the producer. So it's a little bit different style. So we're trying to do a tool available for anybody to use if they wanted to see what it's like and if it applies to any of you. And then after we decide what we're going to work on, so we start with Ohio State University, and then we look at the internal procurement practices. What's the process you have? What's the contract you have? What's the system you have? And then after that, we also trying to produce a self-assessment tool if any of you wanted to know where your gap is so that you can work on internally. And then you map the supply chain itself. And how complicated it is depends on the commodity, depending on the vendor themselves. And then once we map, we're trying to understand the relationship and leverage, because it depends on the relationship and leverage. What you can do is different. Ohio State University picked 3 commodities. One is tomato, one is coffee, and the other one is chicken and eggs, which has a completely different supply chain, a completely different relationship, complete openness to talk to us. So it really depends on the different commodity as well. And then after this, we wanted to go to the farm and then do assessment. Is it really that significant? Is that much to concern about as a buyer's perspective? So that's what the whole process we are looking at. Now, when we're doing this, the most important thing, or parallelly it's important, is the stakeholder engagement. You can come up with great solution that ideal that from the procurement, the buyer's perspective, but you can put that on the table and say, hey, this is going to be the way moving forward. This is going to be how we're going to do the business. But if it's not implementable, it's not realistic. Supply chain, it has to channel down all the way, cascade down to the farms. And then none of the partners are agreeing or seeing it possible to do, it's not going to happen. It's going to be a nice paperwork and put on the shelf and move on. It's nothing going to happen. So in order to have implementable and a sustainable solution, you need to engage with the people in the supply chain. I am thinking about this. What do you think? Do you think it's going to work? And then they're going to give you feedback and challenges. The really important thing is when you're having the conversation, even your vendor, supplier, farmers, whoever they may be, you need to understand their challenges. Because if they said, I can't do this because X, Y, and Z, and if you can help them address those issues, you are almost there to implement this. So it's really important to have engagement. And then external side, this collaboration in a way, that everybody coming together, sharing the same issues, that's a great thing, because I'm sure that everybody have the same issues. And one of the things that challenges you may have internally is internal buy-ins. Because you are not the only one. You may have different hats you're wearing, and it's very difficult to push the agenda forward, especially on the social side. Environmental side, maybe you're making the progress, but social side is very sensitive in a way. Some of the farmers, you may have a local relationship, but it's a local business has been done this way, and if you're coming in to change this, it's not going to happen. It's a different dynamics, especially on the social side. So you need to have relationship building, and an internal buying is very important. You need the resources when you're wearing 3 different hats and trying to do this job. In addition to all of the work you're doing, you may need the support from the above, and resources and budget-wise. And then if your senior management is not buying in, it's very difficult to push in. So that's the internal stakeholder. And then one of the important things, the apparel side, many of you who's a member of the FLA might have been done, is to have a steering committee. So internally, you collect different group of people to have a room to discuss about what you are doing about the social compliance issues. if you have that stakeholder engagement internally as well as externally, that's really the important thing to have a successful solution coming out of this. And this is, I have a colleague, and also the Ohio State University, Rick is here. So if any of you later want to know more about this, we are here. And our colleague Earl is a university representative for the FLA. So we have a university program also here at the FLA that many of the members are part of the apparel side. But if you have any interest in any of this project, we can follow up outside of this as well. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to do a brief overview of AASHE for those who aren't familiar with us, and then quickly describe how we've evolved our definition of sustainable food for institutional procurement, because I think it's pretty relevant for our conversation today. So the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, or AASHE, it's a membership-based association of colleges and universities that are working towards sustainability. We serve as a professional home for paid sustainability staff, but we also offer a lot of resources and services that support other groups in higher ed, like faculty, students, administrators, etc. And we do a whole bunch of things to help our members learn from one another, including conferences and webinars, online resources. But the thing that I want to talk about this morning is STARS, the Sustainability Tracking Assessment and Rating System. And it's a tool that hundreds of campuses are using to measure and report on their sustainability performance. It's a comprehensive system, so it looks at everything from academics to engagement to governance. And of course, one component of it is food procurement. And particularly, we're looking to reward institutions based on the percentage of their food spend that goes toward more sustainably produced food and beverage. As many of you know, that's not easy. There's dozens of eco-labels addressing different aspects of the supply chain, addressing different issues. There's a whole bunch of attributes that are important that aren't covered by certification. And then there are farms that are doing the right thing, but aren't certified for one reason or another. So we've had to struggle to figure out how to assess what portion of spend goes to sustainable products and services. So here's how it's changed over time. When we started, we were pretty simple. We said sustainable food is either of these two things, somewhere produced within 250-mile radius of the campus, or certified. So sounds simple, which was good, but there were some problems. Most notably that there's a lot of things that can happen within a 250-mile radius that might not really be exemplifying sustainability, that really we shouldn't be counting as sustainable. So in the next version of STARS, we complicated things a little bit, and we said, okay, it has to be local and community-based. We put some exclusions. We said it couldn't be from a CAFO. It had to have at least some minimal nutritional value. So you can't count soda just because it's bottled locally. That's not really what we're talking about. And then we also said it couldn't have a labor law violation within the past 3 years from the producer. As you can probably imagine, there were some challenges with this new standard in that gathering the data was really hard, particularly the labor law violation. Finding out if your suppliers had a labor law violation in the past 3 years is a real burden. And so what we found in practice is that most campuses basically ignored the and community-based part of the standard and just continued to report on, here's our local spend, because they had some experience measuring that and they knew how to do it. Since that wasn't really what we wanted, we said, all right, let's take another run at it in STARS 2.1, which is the current version of STARS. And we simplified things a bit, but maybe made some new problems. So we switched the order, so we put the emphasis on certified, and then we said both local and community-based to try to emphasize it wasn't one or the other. You had to be both local and community-based. We dropped the minimal nutritional exclusion, we dropped the labor law violations, and we kept the CAFO one, and this time just said if you have over 500 million of sales annually, you're big enough where really you should be able to get certification, so that there's an exclusion for that. So and then for the first time we added something to get at the consequences of meat consumption relative to plant-based diets, and so we are awarding points based on spending less than 30% of your food budget on conventional meat. So it doesn't discourage more expensive certified meat, but the less you spend on conventional meat, the more points you would earn. So we got some feedback that this wasn't great either. The 500 million standard is kind of arbitrary, and it suggests that big is bad, which is not really what we intended to say, but that was sort of the message that people received from it. And the conventional meat part of this credit was confusing to people. They didn't understand exactly what we meant, and so a lot of people just didn't report on it at all. So we know this credit's been a sore spot for many campuses because of all the work that goes into it. So about 1.5 years ago, we put together a task force to help advise us on, okay, what do we do on this credit? How do we get to something that everybody can live with and meets everyone's needs? And they met back and forth for about a year. We looked at probably 30 or so different iterations of this part of STARS. Ultimately, what we came up with in the new version that is coming out later this year, it's very simple, but you'll notice we have dropped entirely the local and community-based component of this aspect of STARS. And the reason for that, the task force sort of looked at the evidence and they said, that more and more evidence is emerging that local is not necessarily the most significant sustainability attribute. And if you look at the sort of carbon footprint, food miles is a relatively small portion of the total carbon impact of a food product for most types of food. And there are cases where actually getting something from further away has a lower carbon footprint than getting something locally. So given the relatively limited impact of buying local, and the complications that seem to come with it, because we had to have all these qualifications, the task force felt that it was better to just stop focusing on local and focus primarily on certified stuff or plant-based foods. We did add in, we still want to make sure that smaller farms that are practicing sustainability but are too small for certification to be cost effective, we wanted to make sure they're not shut out. So we have this exception for institution-affirmed production. So if your institution has a farm on campus or has a relationship with a local farm that is basically doing what's required under one of our standards, and you want to affirm that as an institution, you can still claim that. So Michigan Dining here purchases from the farm on campus. They can still count that even though the farm is not certified organic, for example. So we hope that keeps access for that type of producer. Anyway, I very much look forward to your questions and your feedback. It's something we're excited about. It's new, but it's been a real challenge to get to this point.
Thank you all. We'll do some prepared questions and then open up the floor for your questions. So maybe start with you, Michiko, as you've worked with OSU on this journey. What do you think, if you kind of generalize from there, and you kind of addressed that, but just want to kind of focus in a little bit more, what is the key to getting institutions, procurement officers to embrace social sustainability? It's not just about the dining operations directors, but broadly at a procurement level. Because the challenge for procurement would be that food is just one piece of all procurement that we're doing. We're doing so much other. So what do you see as, how do we get the procurement officers to think about embracing social sustainability in their procurement guidelines? What are some pragmatic ways to begin their journey?
I touched upon a little bit, but definitely you need to get internal buy-ins because you're not alone on this. And then there's going to be many different parties affected by whatever you decided to do. There's a couple of things would help in that aspect. One is external pressure. I don't know if you call that help or not, more your reaction to external pressure being the student being campaigning on campus to there's a negative media news about your vendor, or it could be your competitors, the similar institution is getting under attack for something. So those could help flag the issues for your management team. Also, I guess I wasn't very strong aware of this, but the university has also either the academic area or the sports-wise, they have a competition going on. So if your competitive university is doing something and if you're not doing something, that may appeal to your management saying, hey, so-and-so university is doing this, but we haven't. So that's another thing that you could, even today, Apparel Side has been working on this for 20 years, but still today I get question from the brand, the company, CSR people, the sustainability people saying, I need to make a case. I don't get enough time. I don't get enough budget for this. I can't do this. And then what's the story I have to tell? And a lot of times the good example is how their competitor has been attacked in the media. And then they'll be like, that could be us tomorrow. So those are the stories that they are sometimes using it. And another thing I thought it was very interesting for the Ohio State University does is they make a trip to farms, the coffee farms, the service trip, they take student. And it's not necessarily for student, also for the staff members. I think it's eye-opening when you see something that you don't have to convince them that what they need to do, but it's kind of instilled in them, like, okay, we have to do something. So those are activities that really help them build the internal buy-ins, because without the internal buy-ins, you could have very good ideas, but if you don't have a support, you can't really implement. And I hate to see a lot of effort put it in and nothing really happens at the end of the day.
Thank you, Michiko. Matthew, very compelling video, the CIW on the tomato work. Can you speak a little bit more on your organization's broader vision, but how it could begin to address an institution desire? Tomato is just one small portion of the spend, as Michiko basically highlighted when they did the prioritization for example, for OSU, it's coffee, it's chicken, it's tomatoes. So, which means, it needs to be a little bit broader across the food commodities. So how do you see your organization supporting an institution's desire to kind of look at the diversity of food commodities? What kind of engagement model do you envisage between your organization and universities? Because what you showed there on the slide was mostly around, brands. So there's an institution piece.
Sure. So I should probably first clarify that the vision, as you could tell from this video, comes from farm workers themselves. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers created the Fair Food Program and is responsible for bringing its current 14 participating buyers on board. Those are the buyers who back the program with market consequences when things aren't right on participating farms. But the Fair Food Standards Council, the monitoring and enforcement wing of the Fair Food Program, operates pretty squarely within the operative principles of the Fair Food Program. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because what we're focused on is looking at the reality of the lives of people like Alejandrina, who you saw in the video. And we want to answer the question, how do you actually make sure that if people are abused in the workplace, if they're sexually harassed, if their wages are taken, these are commonplace issues throughout low-wage ag. How can you ensure that those are actually remedied and dealt with? And I want to talk first about two different principles that are at the foundation of this. The first is that labor rights initiatives have to have a meaningful role for workers. This is something that we all intuitively understand. If an organization was going to come to your workplace and evaluate working conditions and figure out what's going right, what's going wrong, who are the people they should talk to? It's you, right? It's the people who are working there. Who else knows about what's going on? It's not any different for farm workers picking tomatoes in Florida or women sewing your clothing in a factory in Bangladesh. The people who know what the problems are the people who do the work. If they don't have a role, how can you know that the issues that are there are actually being identified and addressed? You can't. The second is that certification systems have to be on a foundation of code of conduct standards that are both binding and enforceable. And this is also something that's pretty intuitive, right? You wouldn't buy a house from someone who refused to sign a purchase contract. That'd be crazy. And that's because a functioning market requires that contractual agreements are binding and enforceable. You need to have good knowledge and faith that what's written down on a piece of paper is actually going to be implemented, and that if it's not, that you can do something about it. So when you look at the Fair Food Program, we've had an incredible success. In 2009, federal prosecutors were still calling South Florida, where Immokalee is, ground zero for modern-day slavery. And the coalition's work has, to this day, helped free over 1,200 individuals from slavery operations in the United States. We can talk more about this. There's a long history there. But the Fair Food Program, 3 years later, after implementing this program with these types of backing mechanisms, right, it was called on the front page of the New York Times the best workplace environment in U.S. agriculture in 3 short years. And the program works because its code of conduct was designed, drafted, and is continuously monitored by the very workers themselves. Participating growers and participating buyers have signed contractually binding agreements with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to enforce code of conduct standards. And the Fair Food Program's monitoring enforcement are second to none. That's what I do. The Fair Food Standards Council every year has one-on-one conversations with at least 50% of the workforce at every participating farm in the fields while they work. We also maintain a 24/7 complaint line that workers can call, and that is answered by the very investigators who are in the field. And as you saw in the video, all of this is backed by these market consequences. If we see real problems on farms, growers are suspended and aren't able to sell their products anymore to participating growers. So in terms of getting to the principal question, if an institution is really interested in making sure that what it's sourcing is produced, and we're talking about labor in this context, but is produced in the most ethical way possible, then universities are in luck in that, just like we heard at the beginning of this morning, there's an incredible amount of institutional purchasing power. And particularly when institutions like universities are aligned with other institutions that share those same values. You have a huge footprint in the marketplace and the ability within the market to actually move demand. Particularly in the case of the Fair Food Program, what we see as a model for engagement is this. First, because our footprint is limited, right? We don't cover every crop at this point. Doing this type of in-depth, verifiable work where if a worker makes a complaint, we're sure that we can protect them and make sure that they don't lose their job for saying, hey, we didn't have drinking water out here, or I got sexually harassed. To do that, it takes a lot of work. We work within a limited scope at this point, but there are things that institutions can do in partnership. The first is that some of the participating buyers in the program include Sodexo, Aramark, Compass Group, and Bon Appetit. Many of you are already working with those suppliers. Purchase as many Fair Food Program products as you can. For what's available, purchase as much as you can. If you're looking for the most ethical thing you can buy, that's it. Where the Fair Food Program doesn't cover the crops that we don't cover, the states that we don't cover, where institutions have relationships with farms, just like we talked about a minute ago, if you have relationships with farms, if you have relationships with other systems, you can help bring those farms into the Fair Food Program and to be certified as Fair Food Program farms.
You're willing to expand beyond commodities if there is interest from the buyer space?
Well, the Fair Food Program focuses particularly on produce, on fresh produce. But we work within a broader network, which is called the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network. The Worker-Driven Social Responsibility is a concept that is a direct response to what we would see as the failures of corporate social responsibility, which has relied for many, many years on voluntary codes of conduct that aren't binding, that aren't enforceable. So that's our perspective, and we think that institutions together, if they really want to focus on sourcing truly ethical and verifiable work conditions at the bottom of supply chains, have the ability to partner together. And the Fair Food Program is very excited to be a part of that partnership.
Okay, thank you. Phil, you've done a lot of work with agricultural compliance, food safety in the Michigan area. Can you talk about some of the biggest limitations with the existing USDA GAP regulations, because it's expensive for certain maybe smaller farms, and suggest perhaps strategies to address these to make it easier for institutions to procure locally, even though Julian's organization is saying, well, I don't really care anymore whether you procure locally. But still, I think our keynote speaker, Alexa, basically highlighted how the power of the purse matters in the local economy.
So really the three main things that I see as barriers are really money, time, and transparency. So money, as was alluded to by the question, one of the questions from the audience to Alexa, the idea that I only have so much money to spend, and how can I really spend this money effectively? And if for those of you who procure currently, you probably would flinch if somebody said, we want you to pay an extra 1 to 2 cents per serving for a certain product. And because it starts adding up in the tens of thousands of servings every day times 365 days a year. So you folks have the same issues that every other person in the supply chain has. A shipper is facing the same issues with dollars and cents that you have. So when you ask them to do certain things like GAP certification or sustainability certification, that's an added expense. It is a cost of doing business, and in many respects, it's a valuable cost of doing business because markets open up because of that. So money is a fairly large sort of limiting factor there. But the other one is time. Michiko talked a little bit about her collaboration with other folks, and as well, Alexa alluded to this in the example she gave with the buns that the high school worked with the entire supply chain. Taking the time to learn about the supply chain and learn about where some of the pinch points are and some of the problems, Michiko specifically spoke to that, really talking to the other supply chain actors to find out what some of the problems are makes a huge difference in terms of the solutions that you come up with that are workable. It gets over some of the money humps as well, because you get to the point where it's like, okay, there's a simple fix we can employ here that will make a huge difference throughout the supply chain in terms of sustainability. So that's the second piece. And the last one is time. All of that takes time. It takes learning about your food system. It takes learning about the supply chain and getting to know folks who maybe don't always agree with everything that you think is true and right in the world, and having difficult conversations. And I know Michiko spoke to this specifically, the fact that she was having some hard times trying to get internal and external buy-in because everybody is sort of has different viewpoints on what's important. So all of those things, the money, the time, and the transparency. The more transparent the system is, usually the more fair it functions.
Thank you. Julian, you spoke about some of the evolution of your rating system, et cetera. But it seems like, given the diversity of institutions that we have, small, large, private, public, et cetera, what are some challenges that you see of coming up with one ubiquitous rating system for institutions of all sizes that you could think about? And the second kind of part of the question really is, you talked about, as the latest definition, sustainable. Where does social aspect of sustainability fit in there? Is there some specific articulation there, or is that all built, or not there, right?
I'll do the second part first, because in a way it's easier. But we do take the social dimensions of sustainability very seriously. And in this particular credit, food that's approved by the Fair Food Council, that counts. Fair trade counts, and a number of other socially focused food standards all count towards your total spend on sustainable food. We also, within the context of STARS, look at the wages the institutions pay. We look at apparel licensing. We look at diversity and affordability programs. So we try to look at the whole range of social sustainability issues, in addition to the kind of typical environmental things that people think of. And that's been core to the program from the beginning. There's still some things we're missing that we're looking to build onto it, but we have tried to make an authentic attempt to get at the social dimensions from the beginning. On the first part of the question on how do we address the diversity of institutions, it's a real challenge. There's no two ways about it. We try wherever we can to normalize based on size, and it gives me some comfort that big schools say, oh, the system is biased against us, and so do small schools. So at least on that front, like, neither side is really happy, but it suggests to me that we found some kind of balance. We have issues with urban and rural as well. And on an individual aspect of STARS, certainly there's things that are easier for big or small or urban, rural, but they're usually counterbalanced by another sector of STARS that's easier for the opposite type of campus. The one sort of division that we have not found a way to deal with super effectively is wealth. Wealthy colleges are going to have an easier time at this. And that's, we've tried to build in ways to minimize that, but just having paid sustainability staff makes a huge difference, even in being able to complete STARS in the first place. It takes a lot of time to collect the data and submit it. And community colleges, historically black colleges, universities often don't have full-time sustainability staff, so they struggle to be able to participate in something like STARS. So that's the area that I think I don't have a good answer to. I would welcome suggestions. We're always trying to figure that out. How do we make sure this system is accessible? But the other dimensions, we feel like we've managed to control for reasonably well.
Do you actually see wealthy colleges being more sustainable?
They do better on STARS. I'll say that. I won't say they're necessarily more sustainable, but they do tend to do better on STARS. Yeah.
Okay. I do have other questions, but I want to open the floor for audience questions. So please raise your hand, and somebody will come with a mic and say who you are. And if you have a general question to the entire panel, that's fine. But if it's to a specific person, please identify that person. Thank you.
Hello, Michaela Bonney from Indiana University. I'm Assistant Sustainability Director there. Thank you all for being here this morning. I have a question specifically for Julian, just continuing this conversation about tracking sustainable food. A couple questions about your most recent iteration in STARS 2.2. So what universities contributed to that food task force? And I've always appreciated that STARS is representative of the broad mission of a university and includes how are we teaching our students? How do we pay adjunct faculty? How do we invest our endowment? It's very holistic. I am concerned in taking away credit for local food, and that gets to one of the missions of a public university, specifically in serving its region and its state. So Indiana University is the largest employer in the state, largest purchaser in the state. Can you speak to how those conversations came up?
Yeah, sure. So to the first part of the question as to who was involved, so I should just say a little bit about STARS governance. So we have a whole network of technical advisors that are all volunteers. They apply to be part of it. It's pretty open tent, though. If you want to be a technical advisor, you can be. So any of you in the room, if you want to help advise us, talk to me after. We have applications once a year. It's pretty simple to be part of the process. We also have a steering committee that is the final decision maker about what gets into the standard. And that's made up mostly at this point of all sustainability staff from about a dozen campuses across the US and Canada. And half of that committee is elected. The other half is appointed to fill in any kind of gaps, mostly to make sure we have diversity represented. We've got community colleges, we've got Canadians. So when the concerns about the food standard in 2.1 came up, we said, all right, we've got to figure out how do we get to something people can generally live with. And so we worked with our existing technical advisors on food and put some additional people on it. So there was somebody from Wake Forest University, UC Santa Cruz, I think. It's possible he's at Santa Barbara. A Canadian institution, Concordia University, and somebody from Real Food Challenge, and one more institution that I'm blanking on right now, were the kind of core group. And they talked to a number of other institutions. We did 2 surveys through the process to get feedback from the broader AASHE community as to what they were thinking, what concerns they had with the food credit. And so that technical advisor worked with, or those technical advisors worked with STARS staff on all these different iterations, which then went to the STARS steering committee. And that's got a whole bunch of institutions on it too. It's on the website if you want to see who they are. And they ultimately approved the new change. And yeah, I definitely understand that for some institutions, buying local is still important, and we don't want to discourage that per se. It's just that the task force and then the steering committee both agreed that the conditions we'd have to put in place to make it so that we were confident that local was in fact sustainable were such a burden from the data collection side that it didn't make sense to continue to sort of ask campuses to jump through so many hoops to be able to report on their local spend. We got complaints every year at the food credit, like, I can't get this data, it's so much work. Our hope is that the new standard, is it plant-based or is it certified, is way simpler and should cut down on that challenge. So that was the main kind of thinking that went into it.
Yeah, hi, Eric Montel from Stanford University. So I would say we'd probably be considered one of the universities that have more resources, or wealthy, as you said. So, and certainly we have sustainability professionals that are on our campus and part of our team. I think we have struggled. I would say, first of all, you're doing yeoman's work on trying to define what does sustainable and ethically produced even mean. And I'm sure within this room, we could debate that all day. So coming up with some criteria, I think we're always trying to understand that as well. And one of the things I think that we're seeking to understand is the goal and the driver for the decisions. What is the behavior change that rating organizations are trying to achieve? Because part of it is to influence behavior and to create change within organizations, incentivize them in some ways to change their habits, change their practices, change their purchasing protocols. But I think that understanding what going back to sustainably or ethically produced in terms of driving behavior change is not quite as clear with STARS. I think that we find it sometimes, and I could say that for many rating agencies, right? But I think we're trying to look at it and say many things fall outside of the third-party verification that can be very strong programs, both large and small. So I can purchase from a very large producer who does not meet the third-party criteria. It's not one of those organizations, and yet they would be discounted. Or I can work with a small local farmer who says, you know, honestly, I can't afford to have third-party certification. You're going to drive me out of business. And so that disincentivizes, I think, what are probably positive attributes that STARS is trying to achieve. So could you talk a little bit more about, I think, in terms of goals and objectives, strategies that STARS in particular has in trying to drive behavior within colleges and universities? And then I have a follow-up question for the whole panel, if that's okay.
Yeah, so big picture, STARS is trying to recognize and incentivize movement towards sustainability writ large in higher ed. In the food procurement section, we are looking basically at, are you using the resources, the dollars you're spending on food to advance sustainability in the food system? And that requires the definition. And so right now we do have the plant-based or certified. But to get at your question about, well, what about these small producers we're working with that can't afford it? That's exactly what the institution affirmed production exception is intended for. So if you know that farm is actually practicing sustainability that's more or less equivalent to one of the recognized standards that we endorse, you can count that. And size doesn't matter anymore. We're not explicitly saying it has to be under any certain size because we just felt like that was arbitrary. So it's really up to you at Stanford if you feel confident that whatever producer is, even if they're not certified, but they're following sustainable practices, you can count it. You'll have to tell us a little bit about it, but you get to count it.
Great, thank you. And my follow-up question for the panel really has to do with, these are all noble efforts in terms of driving better sustainable practices, but many of the examples are used in terms of also driving cost. And one of the things that I think that many universities are strategically focused on is affordability and affordability task force. So it's not just a matter of let's spend additional dollars, but how do we make colleges and universities more affordable for low-income first-generation students and other students that may think of at Stanford, oh, well, these are wealthy students, and certainly we have those, but we also have many first-gen students who are not, that the university is looking at saying, well, let's make sure that tuition, room, and board is affordable. And really, so I was looking to see whether you had examples that kind of take it to the next level, which is sustainable practices that are also reducing cost, or cost models that are being repurposed for other uses. So if you say something drives cost higher, what are other alternatives that are also reducing cost, and looking at models like that? Do you have any examples where a cost is actually reduced by more sustainable practices?
I would just like to make one comment about how little cost there is to move us from problematic practices at the bottom of agricultural supply chains to sustainable ones. The Fair Food Program asked that participating buyers in the program pay an additional approximately 1 to 1.5 cents per pound of Fair Food Program produce that it buys. Over the last, since 2011, that's represented in payments that go directly to supplement farm worker wages, over $30 million that have gone directly to workers. So if you look at, at a unit basis, the cost is very small to transform lives at times.
I can certainly, excuse me, I can certainly speak to from the standpoint of irrigation as a perfectly good example. The preponderance of our agriculture commodities come from California and Arizona, which are pretty significant deserts. I mean, they don't have a lot of water, and that can be attested by most people. When folks switch from an overhead irrigation system to a drip irrigation system, they reduce their usage of water by 90%, which is pretty significant. And that does lead to a cost savings. There is some significant expense in drip irrigation, in implementing drip irrigation, but it usually pays for itself within a season or two.
So I totally agree with your big picture, and that's why we do also have InStar's affordability metrics. So we are really trying to encourage movement in that direction as well. And in some cases, they can be contradictory, and it is a bit of a balancing act. We realize that. But just to give a specific example where you can save costs, trayless dining has been a huge cost saver for many institutions, just in terms of not having to wash the trays anymore, not having to buy the trays, not having to replace them when students take them to go sledding or whatever. So that's an area. Likewise, there's some big opportunities with reducing food waste, and probably already doing this to some extent, but that's another area where sustainable practice and cost savings overlap. Energy efficiency is another area. So sometimes it costs more, but it doesn't have to in all cases.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yes, hello. I'm Carl Lipson. I'm a professor of history at Indiana University and the director of the IU Food Institute. The story of the Immokalee workers is an amazing one and a huge success story, and I congratulate you for being part of it. But combined with the certification creates kind of a paradox insofar as in a sustainable world, we don't grow tomatoes in Florida. Right? So I mean, there's that issue where the issue of labor and environmental sustainability come into conflict. But my broader question is, that's a program in Florida, is my understanding, focusing on tomatoes. To what extent, since the Fair Food program has been implemented, has it spread to other states and to other areas of agriculture?
Sure. Since the start of the program, we've expanded from Florida to an additional 7 states. So moving tomato production basically up the East Coast, up through New Jersey. We've also expanded into 2 additional crops. Those are smaller programs, but they're there. In terms of your initial comment about sustainability, I would just say 2 things. One is one thing that Alexa mentioned, which is that highly environmentally friendly producers represent a very small percentage of the market at this point. And the Fair Food Program's position is less one of being kind of rigidly lodged in just that one place, but it's one of the question of what does it take to actually do monitoring and enforcement the right way. And those principles, those mechanisms are transferable to all sorts of commodities and other goods. And I would encourage people here today to take a look at the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, which includes One of our principal partners there is WRC, the Workers' Rights Consortium, which many of you are probably partnered with already in terms of apparel procurement. As well as another program in this model that has come online in the last couple of years, which is the Milk with Dignity program, which is a very comparable program to the Fair Food program in Vermont Dairy. So we see these are real examples. They're not hypotheticals. They can be transferred to other goods. They can be transferred to other supply chains. The key thing is actually having a certification that means something for the workers.
Okay. Other questions? We have somewhere here. It's coming right at the back.
My name is George Kormuzis. I'm a producer of olive oil. And at least I see one university here that gets it directly from the estate. My question is to Michiko and to Matthew. How far does your arm extend into what is imported into the chain, into the menu planning of the universities? I mean, avocado from Mexico, coffee from Africa. I'm particularly with Michiko. I mean, you don't only deal with coffee that is produced in coffee farms in the States, and also about the chickens. Living in Europe myself, I know that American chickens are not allowed, they're not imported into the EU because of the way that they're treated and raised. So how far do you go to regulate and help universities to identify what is good, what is sustainable, that is imported into this country?
So for Ohio State University project, we wanted to go all the way. Specific to chicken and eggs, it's a bit of a challenge. Although I said earlier, external pressure would help build internal momentum in a way, but at the same time, too much of external pressure would build the wall around the industries. So chicken and egg already have that kind of wall a little bit built. So I think we're having a bit of a hard time tracing all the way down, although we have a bits of pieces of information. So having said that, though, we are trying to go all the way to the farm because we are concerned about the farmers, not necessarily the. Yes, there are issues at the chicken processing plant. Yes, there are issues with at the logistics companies, how the workers are being treated. It's all there, but we are primarily concerned at the bottom of the supply chain. In other countries, in Turkey, we work with hazelnut field, and there's a lot of child labor. So we do work with suppliers there, and then they have been implementing programs to try to prevent. But when you try to do early about the affordability of school, the program itself, yes, it costs money to implement something, but at the end of the day, they're building schools because they don't have access to school. Therefore, they go to work with the parents in the field. And then therefore, if they don't go to school, they have no opportunity to be educated later on in their life. So the money kind of goes around in different ways. Ideally, the local. And part of the thing that I discuss about the stakeholder engagement is if you do something, let's say to build a school somewhere, it's nice to have somebody contribute the money to do this, but then at the end of the day, if you leave, the school closes and nothing happens. So we have to have a stakeholder engagement at the local level so that you can transfer the school at the local level, then it can continue. And then after that, some of the local government steps in and help them stabilize the establishment. So those things we do. And then I think for us, we always go down all the way to the supply chain, trying to identify the needs of the workers so that we can address those issues. The money initially may come from the higher end of the buyer side, but eventually the goal is to be able to transfer this to the local level. And for the coffee one, we haven't worked in a coffee supply chain yet. In the U.S., we don't get coffee, so it's coming from the Latin America or Africa. So we're going to have to go there. And then Ohio State University has a good relationship with the supplier already. So we are going to be working with them moving forward on this project.
So the Fair Food program extends as far as we are able to be truly confident that workers' basic rights are protected, that the human beings at the bottom of supply chains, when they have a real problem, when they're punched in the field by their boss, when they don't have drinking water, when they're sexually harassed, that those issues are first identified, that workers feel comfortable raising the issue, that they feel that they're protected, that we trust that that issue is able to be remedied, and that going forward, we're able to put in place structural measures to prevent it. And the Fair Food Program's had a number of offers from its participating buyers to expand much more rapidly throughout its supply chain. And it's not something that we've been willing to do because we're invested in the reality on the ground for those human beings, just like Hala Andrina, actually being one where they're protected. So, but like I mentioned earlier, relationships that institutions have with farms where you have a major influence or you're a major player in their sales, those are easy areas of expansion for us. You have a farm that you work with, that you trust, that you know. The Fair Food Program is wide open for new farms to join and to help build that relationship between institutional buyers and suppliers.
Take one last question before we go for a break. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Mogtater. I'm the program manager here for the University of Michigan Campus Farm. And on some level, all of you represent different verification schemes. And I know that within our institution and other institutions, there are a lot of varying ecosystems in terms of what factors, whether it's climate impact or local economic impact or labor practices, might be being emphasized at any one time in that institution, and those ecosystems change and shift, and leadership in those institutions changes. So I guess my question to you all is, in your spaces, what advancements or evolutions or solutions do you see for the fact that multiple certifications or verifications could be challenging, and comprehensive ones often don't meet the specific institutional needs in terms of what's being prioritized by that institution? So how do you see that landscape evolving in your guys' sector?
As long as a grower has to pay for certification, I don't see it changing very soon. There's an awful lot of money that's sloshing around in the verification schemes. And that unfortunately, until if everyone was mandated, if we nationalized the system, things might change. But unless it's nationalized or unless profit gets moved out of the certification and verification schemes, I don't see it changing anytime soon.
The Fair Food Program certification for growers up to this point has represented 0 to, at sometimes for implementing a new timekeeping system, something like that, very little cost. There is, and to Phil's point about there needing to be uniform demand, right, or uniform requirement, that is something that's only built through institutional demand. It's built through enough end buyers saying, this is a thing we truly value. This is a thing that's important to us as an institution, that we're going to come together and say, it needs to be real, or it doesn't quite yet meet our standards. And how do we expand the footprint of what we really believe in? And it's a lucky moment that we're all in the same room today.
Anybody else? Yeah.
This is more the personal opinion, but I haven't worked in the environmental social due diligence space. I think it's good to have our own standard in a way, regardless of whether the certification is out there or not. I think partly the scoring of any of the ratings agencies also view it that way. Yes, there are good things the certification, the standards has been accomplishing, but for you to rely on one thing is you're kind of taking the liability for that, the standard or certification that you said you're going to 100% go for. And then if something goes wrong, or if you get out of date, or if your university decided to go a different way, then you have to start from scratch. So I think it's good to have the minimum, in a way, the minimum standard that you have a benchmark for. And also about the university's priorities being changed. Yesterday I had a conversation with Steve at the University of Michigan, and it just occurred to me, social side is very difficult to tackle in a way, and environmental side, a lot of people making progress on. And some of the supply chain traceability we're having a difficulty is because of the wall is being built, that people are getting too sensitive about the issues they don't want to disclose, they don't want to discuss. So when you come to the point, if you already have a good relationship, good traceability on the environmental side for the carbon footprint, for example, you already have access and you already have engagement built there. So you can build upon that, add the little social dialogue into that and then gradually expand. That's also a possibility. So yes, there's a shifting requirement from the university side, but also, yes, it's a different space, environment, local issues, and social issues and environmental issues and local issues. It's all a different space, but there are the commonalities that you can tap into.
So I'll just say we've certainly observed the same kind of ebb and flow of interest in different issues of sustainable food on campus. And we've tried to design STARS to be flexible enough to accommodate that, right? So we have standards for more environmentally focused production, standards for humane, standards for fair, and we're trying to recognize all of them. It's been a challenge just because these sort of different standards seem to proliferate. Certainly since we started STARS, it feels like there's way more now than there were. In a way, it would be nice if there was one comprehensive standard that everybody liked. We could say, this is the one, just by that. But that's not the reality we have. We've got a whole bunch of different eco-labels, and we try to capture all the ones that we think are credible within STARS.
That's all the time we have. Thank you. Let's give a big hand to our panelists.